I haven't done this in a while, so I wanted to begin this morning just by saying hello to our good brothers and sisters who are watching us by way of the live stream, and especially our dear sister Linda Chandler. We know that you guys desperately want to be here, and we want you to know that we love you and you're still on our hearts and on our minds. And I know that one reason, if you're watching at home, you would want to be here in person is because so many of our college students have returned and so many others are visiting with us, that it adds a little bit of extra vim and vigor to our assembly on top of all the great young Christians that we already have with us. And among our visitors today, among the ranks of the college students, is my friend Zeb Shear. And everybody always says, "Did you say Zeb?" And that's right, Z-E-B, Zeb. Although I like to call him the R-H-M. He is my right-hand man. From the very first time we ever met, Zeb was my right-hand man, and we got to be together when I preached up in Nashville and enjoyed a wonderful relationship there, and I'm glad to see him this morning. And quite honestly, glad to see him today because my heart is heavy today because of some losses from members of churches where we used to worship together and other places. And many Christians in those churches are heavy-hearted. A week ago today, Brother Dwayne Starr, who was one of the elders up where I preached in Nashville, where Zeb and I worshiped together, passed away from cancer. Earlier this summer, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and I called him and told him that I had a couple of preaching things to do up in the general area and wanted to run by and see him. In fact, this Wednesday, I'm supposed to preach at a church just across the river from Louisville, so I made my flight plans into Nashville to run by and see Dwayne and Pat on my way up to Louisville, but Dwayne unexpectedly passed away a week ago today. Now, Dwayne was, I think, 90, almost 90 or 90, was a follower of Jesus, led a very long and rich life. So it's one of those circumstances that is bittersweet. When Christy and I got married, her house was about an hour from our building, and she let me move into the house after we got married. So for about 2.5 years, we would drive up on Sunday mornings and have worship and then go grab lunch with someone, often Zeb and his family. And then we would either go crash at the Shears' house or the Star's house. And I would go sleep, and Christy would be nice and visit and be friendly. So you can imagine when you do that for 2.5 years, you get very close to people, very attached to people. So Lord willing, on my way back from Louisville, I'm going to go by Nashville and be at his memorial service. A couple of days later, though, I got news of another loss that was much more difficult to accept. When I preached up in Elgin, Illinois, there was a family there named the Rodriguez family who had a teenage girl at the time whose name was Elizabeth. We called her Ellie. Ellie got married not long after I moved away from Elgin, and she and her husband Matt have 4 children. And a couple of days after Dwayne passed away, I got word that Elizabeth had passed away unexpectedly in her sleep at age 35. Leaving behind her husband, Matt, and her 4 children. That's much more difficult to process than the passing of someone who's older and who has cancer. Now, of course, I'm not the only one who has these stories to tell. Jonathan and Cherie have just come back from his mother's funeral, and all of us here have our stories to tell, especially of unexpected and tragic loss. So this week, I've been trying to think about what I could talk about with you to help us all come to grips with these unexpected tragedies in life. And I could not think of a better place for us to spend our time today than in the book of Ecclesiastes. I'd like for you to turn with me to chapter 12. I think that the book of Revelation is a simple book, and Ecclesiastes is a difficult book. I think it may be the most difficult book in the Bible, in part because of its content, which quite frankly is puzzling to me in most places, but also because of its tone. I used to tell my students when I taught Old Testament poetry that if you are not depressed after you read Ecclesiastes, you will be. On the other hand, if you're already depressed when you read Ecclesiastes, you may find it to be just the stout tonic you need to come to terms with life. That's because of the purpose of this book, which I think is described for us at the end in chapter 12 and verse 11, when it says, "The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd." I like the imagery of a shepherd's goad to picture what I think Ecclesiastes does. A shepherd's goad is either a long stick that has a point shaved on the end or has nails driven through it that have points on the end, which are used to prod an animal that might be stubborn, that might be lagging. And of course, the only reason the shepherd's goad works is precisely because those points are sharp and painful. But sometimes we need that which is sharp and painful to prod us in the right direction. I think that's what the book of Ecclesiastes does. It gives us painful truths that help to move us forward. So I want to talk with you about these truths, these painful truths that help us to come to terms with time and chance and joy. And here is the first. All things being equal, it is better to be wise and righteous than to be foolish and wicked. Go back with me to chapter 7, and we're going to be jumping around quite a bit today in the book. Chapter 7 and verse 19. 7:19 says this, "Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city." Now, in an ideal world at least, civil rulers like mayors and city councilmen and county commissioners are good. It would be chaos and anarchy if we did not have such officials. So that's something that is good. But by contrast, the wise man tells us that wisdom gives more strength than that. That as good as it is to have sort of a stable local government to kind of keep the buses running and the trains on time, even more than that, it is important to have wisdom. Earlier in this same chapter, in verse 5, he says, "It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools." So think about it. Do you like to hear music? Yes. Do you like to hear rebukes? No. We all like songs. Nobody likes a rebuke. But in this case, the wise man says there is a rebuke that is better. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. How much heat can you get from a thorn bush placed on a fire? It gives you very little heat. It burns up very fast, but in the process, it makes a lot of irritating noise. That's the counsel of a fool. It gives you very little light, it evaporates very quickly, and for the most part, it's just a bunch of irritating noise. So it is good to be wise, and it is good to listen to those who are wise. You see the same thing back in chapter 4 and verse 5. Do you remember the proverb about the sluggard that says, a little sleep, a little slumber, do you remember the next line? Folding of the hands to rest. Well, this is very similar. Ecclesiastes 4:5. The fool folds his hands as if to say, I'm not going to work, and eats his own flesh. The ESV, quite graphic here in this verse. The New American Standard and the New King James says consumes. The NIV more euphemistically says they ruin themselves. But the idea is if you're not going to work, you're going to starve to death. It is self-destructive to be a fool, in other words. A couple of more passages that help to emphasize this point that all things being equal, it's better to be wise and righteous than to be a fool and to be wicked. Look over in chapter 10 with me. Chapter 10. This is another passage that talks about how a fool consumes himself, destroys himself. Chapter 10, verse 12, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. The more he talks, the worse it gets. And he multiplies words, verse 14. Though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? He keeps talking and talking and talking, even though the more he talks, the worse it gets. Verse 15, the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Because he is foolish, he constantly goes the wrong direction in life. And as a result, he has to keep backtracking to try to find his way home. It takes him forever. And when he finally gets home, he's exhausted because he's been so foolish. So this book wants us to know it's an advantage to be wise and to be righteous rather than to be foolish. I'll give you one more passage, chapter 2, if you would. Chapter 2, verse 13. Chapter 2, verse 13. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. I bet some of you parents understand the expression, the fool walks in darkness, because I bet some of you in the middle of the night have stepped upon the most painful, deadly weapon known to man, the Lego block. And so you know how dangerous it is to try to walk without being able to see. The wise man says that's what a fool is. It's someone who doesn't know how to see where he's going. But does your Bible say something like, and yet, all things being equal, it is an advantage to be wise and righteous. But that does not provide you with any guarantees in this life. Notice what verse 14 goes on to say. And yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? He's going to die, the fool, and I'm going to die. Not only the wise, but you remember in chapter 1, we are told that this is the wisest person. Verse 16, there have been none wiser in Jerusalem than the one who's writing this book. And yet he's saying, even in my great wisdom, it's ultimately going to be no advantage. I'm going to die just like the fool. And so he says at the end of verse 15, and I said in my heart that this also is vanity. That's the word, that's the theme word of this book. It's empty, it's futile. Whatever advantages there are temporary and transient. And the reason is because all things aren't equal. Remember I said all things being equal, wisdom and righteousness are an advantage. The problem is, in real life, all things are not equal. There are inequities described for us in the passage that Brett read for us this morning. Look with me back in chapter 9, verse 11. And does it seem to me that Brett has grown 1 foot and his voice has dropped an octave in the last 3 months? I'm still waiting for my growth spurt and my voice to change, but it just doesn't seem to want to happen here. Look in chapter 9, verse 11. Again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, or your Bible may say warriors, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. When I was in the 8th grade, of course, we had a PE class every day, and we had different units. So we were going to do a unit of track and field. And as a part of our track and field unit, we had to run a 100-yard dash. So I was going to have to race someone. I had never beaten anybody in a race in my life. I couldn't beat any of you in a race right now. And here I'm going to have to race my friend Greg Durbin and be humiliated in front of my entire 8th grade class in PE class. So they get us up to the starting blocks. I'm thinking, I cannot believe I have to do this. And Greg false started, and then they shot the gun, and I took off, and by the time he rocked back and recovered, it was just a split second enough time for me to beat him in that race. And then I retired from my career in track and field. If you've ever seen that Seinfeld episode, I choose not to run has been my motto ever since then. Now, there is no way, all things being equal, there is no way I should have ever beaten Greg Durbin in that race. But guess what? Time and chance happen to all. There are things that happen that don't make any sense. And that's what the writer here wants us to understand. Verse 12, he says it like this: "For a man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net," treacherous, cruel, "and like birds that are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them." And because of this dramatic uncertainty in life, while you can say in a general sense, in this tough life, you're going to be better off being a wise person and a righteous person, it's not any kind of ironclad guarantee. If you go back to chapter 8, he says this in verse 14. Chapter 8, verse 14. "There is a vanity that takes place on the earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. And there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity." And certainly it is true that the Bible makes general promises about the person who would see long days as a person of integrity and righteousness. But those are not ironclad guarantees to each one of us. And every one of us here has a story to tell of the circumstances that the book of Ecclesiastes just described here. Chapter 7 says this in verse 15: "In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is the wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing." This is what he says he's seen in his life of vanity, a lifetime of futility, a meaningless life, in other words. And so he says in verse 16, "Be not overly righteous and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself?" Which is a jarring verse when read out of context. What do you mean, don't be too wise and don't be too righteous? But in the flow of the book, you understand what he's meaning. If you think that you can pursue an extreme life of wisdom and righteousness in an effort to escape the inequities of life, you're going to kill yourself, because it's impossible to do so. The reality is, as the wise man says in this book, that there are no guarantees in this life. And at the end of the day, no matter how wise you are and no matter how righteous you are, you're going to face the same end as the most foolish and wicked person. I'll give you one more passage, chapter 9, verse 2. Chapter 9, verse 2. "It is the same for all, since the same event, death, happens." And notice all the categories, comprehensive in scope. "Righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears is as he who shuns an oath." So now you have a sample of what I meant when I said, if you weren't depressed before you got here this morning, maybe after that sad litany, you're a little bit more discouraged. But remember, this is a goad. It's supposed to hurt. Because the wise man, like a shepherd, is trying to move us to accept the truths that can help us come to grips with this reality. It's so unusual about the way we are wired as human beings that we can see these truths so clearly in everybody else's life. but we never want to see them in our own. I remember when we lived up in Nashville, I taught the book of Ecclesiastes right about the time Christy was diagnosed with cancer the first time. And I had taught Ecclesiastes several times at Florida College, and I taught it in another church previously in my work. It wasn't like I was ignorant of these words, but it was only when I started to experience these truths close to home that I felt the goad of the shepherd. Now then, what am I supposed to do with this? Well, go back with me to chapter 9. Here's what the writer says. Because life is so uncertain, and because it is going to come to an end for all of us, enjoy the simple pleasures of life while you can. Verse 9, enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he's given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toiled under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. What the writer says is, because we just don't know what's going to happen, except that someday we will all die, you need to seize the opportunity right now to enjoy the most basic pleasures of life. And he mentions two of them here in this passage. First of all, he mentions love. Love your wife and take joy in that. Sometimes, when we see a young couple in love, and the syrupy romance of it all, it's easy to snicker. I mean, just look right down here. Ethan and Beth. I mean, I probably ought to go get an insulin shot. It's just so sweet, exuding right here. I'm not diabetic, by the way. Somebody thought I was years ago and wouldn't serve me cake one time. Please, I'm not. I should be, but I'm not. And then look at Reagan and Amy back there. Look how happy Reagan is. Look how happy Reagan is back there. I mean, it's just as they prepare to get married. But here's the thing. There's an important purpose to that syrupy, gushy, romantic stuff. And it's actually a hard and serious purpose. Life is so hard. Marriage is so challenging. And this world of time and chance is so difficult. If you were not swept up in the passion of romance, you would never make the promise you make to love someone forever. Now, that romantic love prompts you to make the promise. And it is Christ-like love that helps you to keep the promise. But they go together. And in this book, which otherwise is an unrelenting march of depression, the few gleaming bright spots in the book have to do with things like love your wife and love your work. Enjoy what you do. This is a theme all through the book. I want to go back to chapter 2, and I'll trace out just a couple of these passages. There are so many of them, though, in the book, which I think is important to see because it gives some ballast to balance out all of the other tough stuff that's in this book. The first passage like this is back in chapter 2, verse 24. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. So there is another pleasure, enjoying food and drink. These passages, sometimes by commentators, are called the carpe diem passages, the seize the day passages in the book, encouraging the reader, in view of the short and uncertain nature of life, to enjoy life while you can. I'm going to skip around. There's so many of them we could read. Go to chapter 5, verse 18. Chapter 5, verse 18, behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. This is something that we all experience. The satisfaction of a hard day's work when we can look back at the end of the end of the day and see that we've accomplished something. And then to sit down and have a good meal. My father-in-law is torturing me right now because almost every day he tells me that he's had some more corn. You know, Illinois is big corn country, and they have some of the sweetest corn up there, and he's taunting me every day with all the corn he's been eating. And then to just sit at night and to spend time with a person you love. And we know what that is. That is the good life. And the wise man wants us to know, cherish that good life because it's not going to last forever. Chapter 11, verse 9. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. The English Standard Version is sort of tame when it says, walk in the ways of your heart. The New American Standard is better. Follow the impulses of your heart. And then verse 10, remove vexation from your heart. That's not a word we use a whole lot. Grief and anger, sorrow, anxiety is how that should be translated. I understand we all have our load in life. We all have our lot in life. And I know that there are many young people who suffer from serious things like depression and anxiety and other forms of mental illness like that. And I don't want what I'm about to say to in any way be taken to make light of that. But I would say to my young friends, and particularly those of you who are in college, don't waste your time in needless, morbid, morose sulking. I have news for you. If you think about the balance in life of responsibilities you have versus freedom you enjoy, you are really at the optimum moment of the balance of those two things. So have fun and follow the impulses of your heart, bearing in mind, of course, as he says at the end of verse 9, that God will bring you into judgment. But this is a time when you should enjoy yourself. Going on into chapter 12, remember also the Creator in the days of your youth before the evil days come. Speaking of the evil days coming to the aged, I'm in a quandary this morning because a certain husband today said to me on the way in, it's my wife's birthday, maybe you could say something. And I want to try to keep anonymity. A. Ulrich was this husband's. No, that's too obvious. Adam U was who it was. And he said, it's my wife's birthday, and could you say something? And so, with really no commentary intended by this, let's continue to read about the decrepit description of the elderly here in this passage. So remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you say, I have no pleasure in them. And I am the last person to be making jokes about old age right now. The other day I texted John Haley, misspelled a word, of course. He misunderstood me, then responded. Then I tried to explain my mistake, and it was like an Abbott and Costello routine broke out on Twitter. And a few weeks ago, I went to go work out in the pool at the Y and got my stuff all together and got down in the pool and realized I left my sunglasses in my bag. And I looked up to the lifeguard and I said, I can't believe I left my sunglasses in my bag. And she said, they're on your head. So that's my life pretty much now. And it just kind of continues to degrade as time goes on. And some of you know about even more serious things that happen that are described in the rest of this chapter about the evil days that come. So here's the thing. Whatever time we have, in such an uncertain world as it is, and such a transient world as it is, enjoy the simple pleasures of life. And here's what I think we are also prodded to do, and then prepare to face God. Chapter 12, verse 13, the famous conclusion. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. And then our translations differ some because in the language, you have the words all and duty and man. But it's unclear as to whether the writer is saying something like, fearing God is the duty of all men, or all men or men have as their total duty. All their duty can be summarized in fearing God. And really both of those things are true. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, or of all the duty of every man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now I will say this, the grim tone of this book should certainly make us even more grateful for a chapter like our good brother Dave read for us this morning at the table, which talks about the difference the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ makes. Because that helps us to understand even more clearly how we should live in a world of time and chance and joy. Christ offers us more than the encouragement simply to seize the day here and now, although the New Testament does say, whatever your hand finds to do, do it heartily as to the Lord rather than to man. But it is through Christ that the vague and murky picture of life after death found in Ecclesiastes is clarified. One of the families that lives elsewhere that's been listening to our Bible study on 2nd Thessalonians, the Wallers up in Tennessee, messaged me one night and said, we just listened to 1 Thessalonians 4 and the discussion of the resurrection. That was exciting. And I thought, yeah, that chapter is pretty exciting. It is exciting to know that we have a hope that allows us to face time and chance not only with the resolve to make the most of the simple joys in this life, but also through the hope we have of the resurrection to face the loss of our friends sorrowful and yet rejoicing. Rejoicing in hope of the joy to come that is inexpressible and filled with glory. And that is the ultimate way that we can deal with time and chance and joy. Please pray for the families of those that I mentioned today and that we have mentioned who are suffering. But most of all, please accept the goad of the shepherd to enjoy life now, but most of all to look forward to enjoying the life to come. And if we can help you do that, let us know while we stand and sing together.